Good afternoon, everyone. I, Sachin Rajgopalan, welcome you all on behalf of SP Mandali's Ramnarayan Ruya Autonomous College, Department of Microbiology, to the second day of the dual webinar lectures. Today, we have Dr. Archana Krishnan, Director of Biogenomics Limited Thane, as our speaker amongst us. I would like to request Dr. Varsha Shukla from Department of Microbiology to introduce the speaker of the day. And the question and answer section today will be moderated by Dr. Mayuri Rege from Department of Microbiology. Thank you.
Dr. Archana Deshpande Krishna. Archana has been a student of our college, of our department, I think in the 1990s. And she graduated with a BSc in microbiology and then joined the Maharaja Sayajirao University, Baroda for her master's in biochemistry. And later on, she did her PhD from IIT. And after that, she has been one of the most significant contributor in the field of molecular biology for our country, because she's been a pioneer in the making of many microbial and mammalian products. She has almost makes all 30 odd products using her expertise in molecular biology and recombinant DNA technology. And Archana has also she has almost 20 papers in very well-known research journals to her credit. And lately, or rather I should say, with her earlier experience in the making of various kinds of diagnostic kits, which she had in the earlier company Molecular Diagnostics, now she is she has the credit of making a kit for the diagnosis of COVID-19. And her kit is being used by people all over India now. And through her diagnostic lab, also the testing for this particular disease is happening. So I think she's the most eligible person to talk on the development of the kit, and that's why her talk today is clearing up for the diagnosis of the COVID-19 disease. Okay, so I request Archana to please start with the talk.
Thank you, Varsha ma'am. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I hope I'm audible to everyone, because I'm speaking from my home, and I just hope the internet from my home cooperates today.
Yeah, we can hear you, Archana.
Okay. All right. So thanks so much for giving me this opportunity, Varsha ma'am. I feel extremely privileged to talk to my to the students of my college, my department, to my teachers. It is extremely gratifying to know that that a talk from me would be of interest to all of you. Um, as everyone says, so the power of microbiology is now all of us are experiencing it, and it has brought the whole world to a standstill. um, I'm going to tell you about my experience in the last couple of months. I have been extremely active about how I could actually help out in a situation like this, and how our society could be benefited. So I have spread myself over the diagnostics area and over a little bit on the therapeutics area, and I have been updating all my teachers about what I have been doing, getting their support, getting information from all my colleagues, from my batchmates, whom I've studied with, and I must give a big thanks to everyone for all the support. Of course, also my team at the Biogenomics, who has been extremely active and extremely enthusiastic about delivering a product like this. So with that, I would like to start this presentation on how we kind of geared up for this diagnostic battle against COVID. We all know this, so let's just figure out what this virus is. So this is a very well-known virus. It's a zoonotic virus. It's an enveloped virus. It has a single-stranded RNA, and its classification is pretty much well known. An important point to note is it belongs to the genus Beta coronavirus, and also has the subgenus Sarbecovirus actually has all sorts of coronaviruses. So the SARS virus, the CoV-2 virus, then there are other viruses which are found in bats. All of them come in this Sarbecovirus subgenus. What you see here is an electron microscopic picture of the SARS virus. So you can see those spike proteins, and it's almost like a crown. So that's exactly why this family of viruses are called as coronaviruses, right? How does this actually affect? I'm sure all of you know, but just to quickly recap, the COVID virus basically starts its journey through the nose, or the mouth or the eyes, and it travels down to the lungs into the alveoli, which is where the air sacs, where the gas exchange takes place. Now, the alveoli is basically made up of two types of cells. There are type 1 cells, which promote, which have a thin cell wall, and through which gaseous exchange takes place. And there are type 2 cells, which secrete surfactants, and these surfactants prevent the alveolus from collapsing. Now, what our friend SARS-CoV-2 does is actually binds to the type 2 alveolar cells on a receptor called as ACE2. Okay. Now, once it attaches to this type 2 cells, it takes over the entire cellular machinery, it replicates, and because of which the type 2 cells are not able to secrete this surfactant-like substance, which results in collapse of the alveoli. Now, the entire response is from a mild infection to a moderate infection to a severe infection, is because this surfactant is now not enough, and now the entire alveoli is full of proteinaceous rich fluid, which actually results in an impairment of the gas exchange. Now, at the same time, there is a massive immune response that is going on as the type 2 cells are destroyed. These type 2 cells secrete several cytokines and chemokines, which result in immune cell activation. So macrophages, neutrophils, T cells, they are all recruited, and that leads to a huge cascade of further release of other cytokines like the interleukins or the tumor necrosis factor. All of this results in something called as a ARDS and a shock syndrome, which leads eventually to a organ failure. So this is, hello, yes? Can I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Just requesting all to mute their.
Yeah. So that causes a massive immune response, and this is how the alveolus collapses, and then there are breathing difficulties and so on and so forth. Now let's come to the microbiology part. Let's understand what this virus is and how are we going to. The talk today is going to be focusing on how we are going to be detecting this virus or the ways of diagnosing a COVID disease. Let's look at the structure of the virus. So the virus basically you know, is a RNA virus. It has about 29 to 30,000 bases long. It's a long RNA, which encodes structural proteins and non-structural proteins. All right. Now, within these structural proteins, there are some very key proteins such as the E gene, the M gene, the S gene, and the N gene. Within the non-structural proteins, there are other enzymes such as the proteases or the RNA polymerases. So all of these together uh, are, help the virus to replicate. Now let us go into each of these proteins and understand what the significance is. So it's important for us to understand what each of these protein does to actually figure out how we're going to diagnose it. So let's first of all start with the S protein, the spike proteins. I was telling you it is called coronavirus because it has got a crown of protein spikes on its membrane. So these spike proteins are actually very, very interesting because these are the ones that bind to the ACE2 receptors of the type 2 cells of the alveolus. Now, from a molecular perspective, it's very, very important to understand this because this is the protein which binds with very, very high affinity compared to the other coronaviruses. The COVID spike protein binds with much more affinity to the ACE2. And that is one of the reasons why this virus is extremely infectious, correct? So spike proteins are being targeted in terms of therapy, in terms of vaccine, in a way that for a vaccine, using a spike protein antigen as an antigen could probably give the body a signal of previous exposure. So it can be used as a vaccine. Similarly, if you can block the spike protein using a receptor kind of an analog or a monoclonal antibody which could bind to this spike protein, that could be used as one of the therapeutic pathways. So spike protein is very important. However, it's not extremely conserved. So from the diagnostic point of view, it may not be a very good choice. The second important protein is the N protein or the nucleoprotein. Now this nucleoprotein is actually bound to the RNA in the virus. It actually packages this RNA genome into this ribonucleocapsid, and it is an important. It basically helps in replication, transcription virus, and it is extremely conserved in the COVID gene. So this becomes a very interesting candidate to look at as a diagnostic target. Coming to the other proteins, there are proteins called as the envelope protein. So the E protein, the E gene. Now the E gene is conserved over the entire coronavirus family. However, it's not very specific for the COVID, for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Of course, it is the envelope protein, so it helps in forming the pores in the host membrane and to cause infection. It also plays a role in the apoptosis of the cells. There is a M protein, which is also not a very conserved gene, but it is a component of the viral envelope. And then there is the RNA-directed RNA polymerase. You see, this is an RNA virus. So it requires an RNA-dependent RNA polymerase for the transcription and replication and transcription of the genome. And this also is an extremely conserved target. So there are two targets which we have identified till now. That is the N protein and the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. That is the RDRP gene. So these two genes become very crucial as diagnostic targets. Now, this thing has erupted somewhere in December in Wuhan, and it's taken the world by storm. But it's not really given researchers too much time to focus and develop, methods of tackling it. So for developing a diagnostic test so rapidly is very, very important that you should know the genome sequences. I'm going to discuss what kind of challenges you would encounter to develop a diagnostic test like that. So number one, the genome sequences have to be known. So luckily, somewhere around January end or February first week, there was a paper published where the Wuhan strain, the entire genome was mapped and was sequenced. Then there was the strains from, eventually strains from Hong Kong, and then from Europe, from Italy, and from the US were sequenced. And there were several small, permutations and combinations, but most of them were conserved on the N gene and the RDRP gene. So the genome sequences were known just as late as February. Nobody knew what kind of immune response the population was giving towards this virus. So when was the IgM developing? When was the IgG developing? So there was no clue on that. So it is very important for, if someone has to develop an antibody-based test, it's important for us to figure out what is the immune response profile that this virus generates. Then, of course, there is a science. So there is a lot of method development challenges. So how do we design the primers, the probes, or how do we make a very cost-effective kit? Apart from that, the basic things like you have to make sure that it's a sensitive kit, so it can detect very low viruses or very low viral loads. It has to be very specific. So it has to detect only the coronavirus, the COVID-19, and not any others coronavirus in the family. Then it has to have a sensitive limit of detection to be accurate. It also has to be reproducible in a lab. So if I'm designing a kit, some other lab is going to use my kit and they have to get the same result. So all of that becomes very, very critical. And all of this had to be done in a short span of time of about 2 months. We really worked through this and came up with a kit. So I'm going to show you how we did it. So before that, I will tell you the various approaches towards the diagnostic strategies. So you could do several approaches. First approach being, you can detect the antibody. So you can detect the IgM or IgG, but these are largely indirect markers. So they are the way the body has responded to the infection. It detects the antibodies. So it indicates exposure or a current infection. The second approach is to detect the viral nucleic acids. So either you detect directly the viral RNA, which is a direct marker, and if it is present, it indicates the presence of the pathogen in the sample. The third thing is to, as I was saying, the severity of infection as it increases, there is a cytokine storm. So this is a detection of the cytokine markers forms the later part of in the pathology or the diagnosis of COVID, and it indicates a very advanced stage of the infection. But something interesting would be detecting the viral antigen. Okay, everyone talks about detecting antibodies, but there are very few kits that are getting developed on detecting the antigen. So that was one of the, apart from the PCR based detection kits, we focused a little bit on how we could detect viral antigens in the in the sample. And finally, how some very interesting CRISPR based technologies coming in that could rapidly detect. So we'll have a quick small talk on the CRISPR based detection of COVID-19. So let's start with the antibody detection. So we know that the primary response antibody is IgM, and then after the secondary response is the IgG. Now IgM is very high, has very high specificity, and it is produced it appears only on day 1 to 7 of the acute infection. So there is exposure, there is an incubation time, then there is fever, and about 5 to 7 days later, you will be able to probably detect the IgM antibody. All these profiles again have been only apparent after, around February. The data has started trickling in, and then the profiles are now known. IgG, of course, starts a little later and peaks around 9th or 10th day, and it remains positive, and it indicates, of course, past exposure. So there are lots of discussions and talks about why an antibody detection is a smarter way to go. And yes, it is definitely smarter. There are lots of pros to detecting an antibody, along with the disadvantages. So let's discuss the pros and cons for detection of the IgM and for detection of the IgM IgG. So first thing is, of course, it is very affordable. Imagine a pregnancy kit like strip, and you just put your specimen, and then you can the serum sample, and it can be a point of care device. So you need not go to a healthcare or a lab facility to do a test. You can do it at home. It does not require any expertise, and it's extremely useful for screening large masses. And a positive, of course, a positive IgG can, a person who is tested positive on IgG can go back to his normal routines. But the cons, the disadvantages are that immune systems in each individual varies. So it's not necessary that a person X who's IgM positive in the 7th day will be positive for a person Y, correct? So the responses are very varied. There are in fact many cases in which IgM responses went up to almost about 14-15 days, which was very late in the disease. So that was not very advantageous. Also, if it is a negative result, does not actually say that you're negative, because you could still be in the incubation phase, or you could be in still a asymptomatic phase. So a negative result will not confirm that you are negative for COVID. So sensitivity of detection is also very low. And now there are so many people in the market who are producing these products without any validations, and that is causing a lot of chaos in the diagnostic space for antibody detection. So the next possible way is, of course, detecting the viral nucleic acids. So real-time PCRs, all of you must know, I'm sure you all have studied in your course curriculum. Real-time PCR is a very, very effective way to detect the viral RNA. It, of course, has to be targeting the most conserved gene of the viral RNA. It is specific and sensitive towards SARS-CoV-2, and it can detect as early as the 2nd or 3rd day of the exposure. So even in the asymptomatic phase, it can detect the presence of virus. Now, it requires a little expertise in terms of infrastructure, in terms of handling the entire PCR reagents. So its processing time is about 4 hours, including the RNA extraction. Now, if I were to make a kit that makes PCR detection, or a PCR-based detection kit, what all would I require? I would require, first of all, virus-specific primers. I would require virus-specific probes. Okay. I would also require a positive control, which would always give me a direction that my assay is heading in the right direction. You would require, of course, a reverse transcriptase, because it's an RNA virus. So RNA has to be converted to DNA by reverse transcriptase. And then you'll require the PCR reagents, which are mainly the Taq polymerase and the DNTPs and the magnesium and all of that. So I actually pulled out a very nice animation on real-time PCR for those of who are not very familiar. I'm not sure, Varsha ma'am, is everyone familiar with PCR and real-time PCR over here?
Right.
Actually, basics, I think people will know. But
If
if
she
you,
has an
yes,
animation,
yes,
let her put it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yes. Yes, Archana.
Okay.
Because it's a mixed crowd. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so this is a very basic animation. I thought it was a very interesting one because it gives you an idea more or less on how this technique works. Okay. Uh, okay. So let me just quickly take you through this animation. It's basically a quantitative PCR. Okay, it can quantitate how much virus. It can not just tell you whether it's there or not, but how much of virus is there. There are two methods. One is the CyberGreen based method and a Tachman probe. And I'm going to focus on Tachman probe. Okay. There are several reagents that are used in assembling the PCR mix. Okay. Now, how it starts is that you first of all take a little bit, this is the concoction of the PCR mix. You take the buffer for the enzyme, you take magnesium, which is a basic building block, you take again DNTPs, the DNA polymerase, the primers, and the probe, okay, and you put the target DNA. This entire tube is then put into a PCR machine, okay, which is basically a thermal cycler. Now this concoction has the target DNA. If the sample has coronavirus in it, then it will have the target DNA, right? Now, what the PCR is basically in the PCR, the first step is you denature, you heat the DNA up to 95 degrees, where all the A, T, and GC bonds break and the double-stranded DNA separates into a single strand. After which, the primers and probes are annealed. Now, here is the catch. This is a probe that is seen, which has a reporter and a quencher. Now, uh, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to sorry about that. I'm going to go a little slow and keep pausing. Okay. So I came up to this. So the double-stranded DNA melts. Okay, now let's talk about this probe. Now this probe is a very interesting, it's a very interesting molecule. It has the sequences of the coronavirus, but it also has a fluorescent molecule on one end, and on the other end of the sequence is a quencher. So when the fluorescent donor and the quencher are together, then there is no fluorescence. The moment the donor and the quencher go apart, there is appearance of fluorescence, right? So there is a reporter and a quencher, okay? When they are in close proximity, there is no fluorescence. The moment they move apart, you have fluorescence in your tube, all right? Now, remember this concept, because what happens in annealing is, what happens in extension is that the DNA polymerase would come and extend, and this DNA polymerase has the 3' to 5' exonuclease activity. What is it doing? It's cleaving off the probe, and the reporter and quencher are moving away, because of which you get detection of fluorescence. This happens in first cycle. Second cycle, the same steps are repeated, where it is melted, primers and probes come and anneal, and then there is an extension where again the reporter and the quencher are fall apart and there is presence of fluorescence. Same thing happens in cycle 3, where you have denaturation, you have annealing, and then you have an extension. So as your polymerase synthesizes, you get increase in fluorescence. So in cycle, as you increase the number of cycles, your fluorescence is going to increase in your PCR tube. So as you see, at the end of 30 cycles, you will get almost 1 million copies of the specific target. right? And along with that, we will also get fluorescence. Now, how is this fluorescence detected? So to detect it, the machine inside has a light source, which is an excitation filter. Most of the times it's a UV filter. And fluorescence, as you know, is detected at 90 degrees, right? At a perpendicular angle. So there is an emission filter which detects the emission, fluorescence emission. Now, this fluorescence emission is then further detected using it is analyzed using a software. Now, what this software actually plots is this. You have to actually plot the number of cycles, the fluorescence units versus the number of cycles. So now if you look at this, typically you'll get a lag phase, then you'll get a exponential phase, then you'll get a linear phase, and then you'll get a plateau, correct? So here you have the baseline, and then you have a threshold value, okay, for each each sample. It's called as a CT. It's a very important parameter. Now, if you have different concentrations of the target DNA or RNA, you will get different types of curves like this with different CT values, correct? So each of them will give you a different CT value. So 10 to the power 8 here is giving CT of 18, and so on and so forth. So the higher the amount of target DNA, the lower the CT will be. Correct? If you plot a logarithmic scale of template versus CT, then what you get is this. You'll get a good calibration curve, which looks like this, which is a fantastic calibration curve that you can see. And then you can actually quantitate the amount of unknown target sample. So this is what the overall principle of a real-time PCR is. I hope it's clear, but I can't simplify this beyond this.
No, this is it. This is absolutely fine.
Yeah. So based on this, a lot of assays were designed. Several organizations like the CDC of China, the CDC of US, the Pasteur Institute, then there was Infectious Disease Institute of Japan, Hong Kong, Germany, all of them came up with their own protocols. And if you see, most of them, like for instance, the CDC protocol, as I said, the N genes are extremely conserved. So the CDC protocol targets the N1 and N2 genes, whereas the WHO protocol actually focuses on first a screening for the E gene, which is a general gene for the Sarbeco strains, and then it goes for this for detecting the RDRP, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase gene, which is very, very specific to SARS-CoV-2. So everyone has their own kind of protocols. And based on that, we decided that we will stick with the CDC because we had seen a lot of cases in our diagnostic experience where you could, we saw patients getting a positive in the E gene, but not the RDRP. So it doesn't give you a lot of confidence that it's a COVID negative situation. So we decided we would focus only on the N1 and the N2 genes, which is only the specific COVID gene. So based on that, we have designed our kit. We have called it as BioCov ID. We focus on detecting the N1 and the N2 genes. It's approved by the ICMR and the NIV. Then comes some interesting other ways of detection, that is through the CRISPR system. Now we all know that the Cas9 is a very well-known CRISPR genome editing enzyme. Okay, it is like a molecular scissor which cuts the targeted DNA at a specific location. Now there is a company called as Mammoth Technology, and now the name of this entire technology is Detector. Okay, so DNA endonuclease targeted CRISPR transreporters. This is not yet approved by the FDA, but it is an extremely interesting product because it is it can detect within 45 minutes, which is little faster than PCR, though it is not as sensitive like PCR. Now, what this particular technology does is it uses an enzyme called as a Cas12, which is again a molecular scissor, somewhat like Cas9. And if you have, it has a mechanism in which you have the guide RNA, that is, which is specific to the coronavirus gene. You design that guide RNA and couple it with the Cas12, and it is arranged in the form of a lateral flow device. So here, if the Cas12 and the guide RNA, it searches for the sequence match in the sample. Now, if the RNA is present in the sample, then the Cas12 will start cutting the sample. And there are additional RNA reporter molecules which are tagged with FAM kind of fluorescent dyes, which produces a color when it is cut. So it's a very interesting concept, but still at a very, very preliminary stage. But it would be, its sensitivity is not as good. It can detect as much as 100 copies of viral RNA per microliter, whereas PCR can detect as low as 3 copies of RNA per microliter. But yet, being a test that can show you a result in 45 minutes, it can be interesting to look at as a point of care device. Point of care devices are very critical because it simplifies lives for the patients and the healthcare workers. So the entire industry is trying to figure out how point of care devices can be made. And if you ask me, if these point of care devices can be based upon, of course, the CRISPR mechanism, but it can be also based upon, can we detect the viral antigen? Now, we had a lot of brainstorming on this, and we thought, let's come up with something which is very simple to use, that the patient, whoever is suspecting himself whether he's carrying the COVID or not, can test it himself at home. All right. So we again went back to the structure of the virus. If we were to detect the viral antigens, okay, is it possible? So of course, the spike protein becomes a very interesting antigen to detect. Now, this is all work in progress, but I'm just showing you kind of a schematic on how we are thinking that this test would pan out. So imagine you have a viral, you have a nasal swab or an oropharyngeal swab. You take your own swab and put it into a buffer. So that kit has a buffer which has a lysis buffer. Okay. Now, in this lysis buffer are reagents such as surfactants which could dissolve the viral envelope, so it could disintegrate. So you incubate the sample in the lysis buffer for about 30 minutes, and that's your viral lysate. Okay. Now imagine a lateral flow device like that. Your first pad, which is yellow, has the now if suppose we are talking about the S antigen that is going to be detected, so your first yellow pad will have the antibody against the S antigen, which is labeled. Okay. Now this antibody would most probably be raised in an animal like a rabbit or a rat. Let's take rabbit, for example. So it's a rabbit antibody against the S antigen. Your primary and secondary the detection would again be the same antibody against the S antigen. The primary antibody would be the same antibody against the S antigen, but it will not be labeled. And the secondary antibody would be the anti-rabbit IgG. Okay. Now imagine that if this sample, which is now the lysate of the virus, is spotted onto the place of application and it flows through, if there is S antigen, it will couple with the labeled antibody, and then it will move ahead. If when it encounters the primary antibody, it will get settled over there. Okay. So your primary antibody, so the test, this is what we call it as test window, will be lit up. Further on, it will move ahead. Because it's a rabbit IgG, that will also light up. So your control will also light up. Similarly, if it is negative, the primary will not light up, whereas the secondary will light up. So that is how these kind of devices are actually made and they are designed. And this is still work in progress, but I thought it's an interesting forum to share this idea. So this is what our entire work on diagnostics for COVID is shaping up to be, and we are now in the manufacturing phase of our kit. This is our plant at Pondicherry. It's a GMP manufacturing plant where all the kits are getting assembled. This is what it looks from inside. Of course, this is not our primary business. Our main focus is to make recombinant insulins and recombinant biologics. This is what you see is the upstream area where you can see fermenters, you can see cell disruptors, you can see centrifuges, you can see a downstream production plant where this is a process HPLC, and you can see a fill finish machine. This is again a diafiltration system, and we have a full-fledged analytical services department in Thane, where we have all the machines such as surface plasma and resonance. We can do capillary electrophoresis and all of this. So this is long and short of our capabilities. We are basically about 15 years old, about 200 employees. Our facilities, our research lab is in Thane, near Tikujiniwadi, and our manufacturing setup is in Pondicherry. Primarily, we have all insulins and analogs and all the diabetes related products. We also have some interesting recombinant enzymes. These are some of our products that I thought I'll show you all. Most of them are going through clinical phase, and hopefully, I hope this COVID does not impact our timelines, but we will be in the market by end of this year. So thank you very much. I think this is where I will end my talk.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a fantastic overview of the current diagnostics scenario. Also, any potential people who want to eventually join industry, I hope you will consider biogenomics strongly, because that was just amazing. So I think please post questions in the group chat. I have a few, so I'll get started with that. Archana ma'am, can you please comment on the approved biogenomics kit with respect to the sensitivity, stability, etc.? And does it, more importantly, does it need a nasal swab as a sample, or will a saliva work?
Okay, so the kit is evaluated by NIV, and they have given us specificity of 100%, and they have given us a sensitivity of almost 92%, which is also very good. We don't want it to be overly sensitive, so because PCR is always known to be very, very sensitive. So we're happy with that. So they were happy with it, and they've given us an approval. Your second question was, what's the sample?
Yes.
So sample is definitely a targeted sample. You can, I mean, in an ideal scenario, it has to be a focal specimen. So obviously a nasal swab or an oropharyngeal swab, or even a saliva is fine.
Saliva is
fine. Yeah. Any one of them is fine. You have to do an RNA extraction before you do the PCR, actual PCR.
I also like how you covered the whole span. Okay. Oh, we have a question. Sorry. From Zui. Ma'am, what could be the reason to select real-time PCR specifically, I guess, for the particular diagnostic test?
What could be the reason?
I think why RT-PCR and why not any other PCR, or maybe the antibodies? I think that's what she may be asking.
Is that okay?
That was kind of explained, but maybe you could go over it again.
Yeah. So real-time PCR, no, it is more sensitive than just doing a PCR and a gel. See, at the end of it, it's the detection that is important, right? So when you're detecting it visually on a gel, it's not as effective as when you're detecting a fluorescence reading. So in that context, if you do a visual detection using a PCR and gel, I think that, I hope that is the question. So if a PCR and a gel would give you a sensitivity of about 80 to 85%, whereas the real time will take you to a almost 90 to 100% sensitivity. So that is why real time is more preferred. Also, see, today there is not much treatment available for COVID. So quantitative has a limited significance. When is quantitative very important? It is important when there is a patient is infected, his viral load is 10x. After treatment, his viral load has come down to 2x or x. Okay, that is where that is where it is quantitative is important. But today it's only qualitative. Real time can actually detect the qualitative as well as quantitative. So eventually when there will be a treatment, it will be a very easy switch for us to make to a quantitative PCR.
Okay. I missed some earlier questions by Sachin. So what is the biosafety level to work with SARS-CoV-2? What is the smallest number of virus particles that can be detected by the PCR?
Okay, so the biosafety level, we don't work with the live virus at all. What we have done is to make the positive control, we actually have cloned the gene of, if we are targeting the N1 gene, we have cloned the N1 gene in a vector, and that becomes your positive control. So we can don't have to have high biosafety levels. You can have a BSL-2 and that should be good enough for your PCR. What is the smallest number of viruses? So that is limit of detection. So the least number of viruses that can be detected is about 3 copies, 3.25 copies per microliter is what the detection limit is. Are there any variable?
Yeah.
Are there any variable regions in the N gene as well? So N gene, very interestingly, there were reports in the middle saying that there are strains in India which are not that infective. There are now multiple strains emerging. So we are on a constant search for what kind of strains and where are these strains varying. And sure enough, the N gene and RDRP are rock stable. There is not much variability in these two regions. The S and the E is where there is most variability. So they will not be the perfect targets to choose as our PCR detection targets,
Okay. And I think the last one that he asked was also pretty interesting. Like, how for novel infections, how do we know which regions are variable and which are conserved?
How do we know?
In the genomes of novel infections, because how do we know which regions are variable and which are conserved? I guess before extensive sequencing, do we have any idea?
Unless you sequence it, there is no way of figuring out. So as I said, it was as early as February that the first sequences started coming out. And that's when everyone started figuring out which gene is a good gene to target. So it's a very, very new, all this information is extremely new. And it's being analyzed every day. As newer strains are approaching, coming out, we are figuring out that and doing our alignments and checking whether there is anything new happening here.
Then we have one from Arvind. Can it detect all 11 strains of COVID-19 currently in the country?
Yeah. So
okay.
I'm saying that N gene and the RDRP, they seem to be very rock solid. They are not changing that much.
Okay. Sanchit, I'm not sure if ma'am can answer this, but maybe if she can, which are specifically the reporters and quenchers that are used?
Yeah, okay. There are very known fluorescent labels. There is FAM, there is VIC, there is X, and each of them have their own. There is Sci-Fi, there is Sci3, there is Texas Red, and all of them have their own quenchers. So there is an entire BHQ group of quenchers. There is BHQ 1, 2, 3, etc. So all of them are. This is how we have made our primers, primarily using FAM, VIC, and HEX, because these, you have to see the kind of PCR machines that are available in the country in our diagnostic setups. Okay, if you normally a diagnostic lab would have a 2-color or a 3-color detection, something as fancy as a 4-color and 5-color, where you could detect something like 5 or 6 genes at a time, will be of only research use. So we had to design our kit such that it can be used on most machines in the country. So then the choice of the dye becomes either a FAM or a WIC or a HEX.
Okay.
Can I interrupt, Mayuri?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I just thought, in case if it's possible, both of you switch on your videos. People can,
Okay.
Oh.
yeah, it would look nice.
I think having ma'am's video is better than trying video issues. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Are the diagnostics and drugs, given the similarity between SARS and COVID, are the diagnostics and drugs that were used then, are they being used now? I think is one question.
For diagnostics, it is a different, the genes are
Yeah.
they are more specific towards COVID. In fact, you don't want to detect SARS. You want to detect specifically COVID. As far as the drugs are concerned, not sure about this question, but I think a lot of antiretrovirals are being tried. Lots of repurposing of drugs are being done. But I don't think there's any major success as of now.
Okay. Let's take this question from Ronak. He's asking, he talks about the antigen detection ones. So when we talk about detecting antigens, can we use antibodies to detect the viral RNA? And if there are problems, what would be the case in such a scenario?
Definitely it can be used against the again there are the protein RNA complex would definitely have antibodies against it. Unfortunately, the time span of this is so small, because to actually get a antibody for the virus requires again a whole lot of work. So you need to take the virus, the live virus, or you heat inactivate it, inject the rabbits. From the rabbits, you make monoclonal antibodies specific. You characterize them, you purify them, you characterize them that they bind to this particular region or not, and then you make a kit out of it. So you see, it's a lot of it's a PhD work that has to be done in like 2-3 months. It's very difficult. But there's still now there is no antibody I have seen till now which detects the viral RNA. There are antibodies people are talking about for the S antigen and for the membrane protein.
Okay.
Not for the viral RNA.
Okay. And I think there are two types of spike proteins. So which one are you targeting? I think Sanchit wants to make an.
Yeah. So it's the S1 protein, which has the RBD domain, receptor binding domain, which is the most and immunogenic, and that's what everyone is targeting.
Okay. Abhishri asks, positive suspects are quarantined for 14 days, but I think given your antibody profiles and things like that, why not more days than that, I guess is her question.
Yeah.
This is more of a question for the government, not for ma'am, but maybe you can comment on it.
But I guess after 14 days, you generally see a recovery to in terms of health, you see a recovery to the disease. So that's why I think 14 days is fine. It's sufficient. It may not be sufficient to give you the exact immune response. It's again,
and you're probably not infectious after that point.
Yeah, and again, immune response is so variable from person to person. It's very difficult to predict. So they have generally taken a 14-day period, which is kind of a, you would not expect a infection after that.
So there are some questions. So students, you should, I know there is a lot of interest, but try to restrict your questions related to the topic of the talk. So I think from Parth, this is a question from Parth. If the RDRP gene is not variable, then what is the reason for the success we are observing with the antiviral drugs that are targeting replication for replication of SARS-CoV-2.
RDRP
So,
gene. I
yeah.
think the trials are still on. I think
Mhm.
Glenmark is doing one trial. There's
Mhm.
one trial being done, I think, by J&J for antiretroviral, and they are most of them targeting the RDRP gene.
Mhm. I think there's one from Shriom. As you, mm, what are the chances we can use the same CRISPR-Cas9 system for treatment of patients? For treatment? Oh, wow. By targeting the RDRP or M gene of the virus.
Most definitely, someone has to start taking the problem. Definitely, it can. It is very much possible that if it can be used as a diagnostic tool, most definitely it can be used as a treatment tool as well. But I think CRISPR-Cas, the problem is about delivery into the uh, into the lung cells. I think that it has to be liposome mediated, etc. And again, there'll be a lot of clinical trials that go behind this. But conceptually, as a fundamental concept, it is definitely possible.
Okay, I think there's a question about vaccines. This is not directly related to the talk, but maybe, ma'am, you can reflect on this. We have, I think this might be the last question we take because of the interest of time. So many vaccines are being produced nowadays. So which of these various types of vaccines do you think would be best, and what might be the side effects?
So the fastest, basically there are 4 or 5 types of vaccine. One is a live attenuated virus. One is a heat-killed virus, which is very straightforward. The heat-killed is very, very straightforward. The live attenuated would probably take a little bit of time, but people have already got a lead on that.
Mm-hmm.
These 2 vaccines will definitely come up the fastest. Then the recombinant, where most of them are targeting the S1, the RPD domain of the S1 protein. That would require a little bit of clinical trial and evidence to show that the antibodies that it generates are neutralizing antibodies, and they will actually take care of the immunity of the patients. Then there is mRNA based vaccines, which are adenovirus based vaccines basically. Again, a lot of trials going on. So I would think that the heat killed and the live attenuated will go the fastest. Yeah.
Okay. And I think several people asked about the cost of your detection kit. So maybe you can mention that again.
We are trying to make it as cost effective because it's a make in India company made here. So we are seeing if we can offer it to labs about 600 rupees per patient, so that of course the labs will have their own markup, because they will have their own overheads. And I think about 2000 rupees it will be at the end of the day to per patient. We are trying to get that kind of
Okay. And Varsha ma'am asks, is your kit patented? I'm sure it is. Oh no.
No, you can't patent this because right now it's the need of the hour. So for COVID, it's been declared that it cannot be patented. None of it can be patented.
Nice.
And if I may add, diagnostic kits in India are not patentable in any case.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
We
Okay.
are a developing country, so we can't afford that. Otherwise, it marks up the prices. So there is a section in the Patent Act wherein there's things that are not patentable. So this is under non-patentable things as it is.
Absolutely.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 4 o'clock, it's past 4. So I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Archana ma'am, for this fantastic talk. This was a great webinar, and I think today we didn't have as many technical issues. Anushree ma'am, you have turned on your video.
Yes, Varsha. Varsha.
Hello.
There.
Hi. I'm still having video issues. I'm sorry. So I'm going to give the quick vote of thanks. So I would like to thank our management, SP Mandli, and our honorable principal and head of the department, Dr. Anushri Lokul, for being so enthusiastic about these webinars and learning even in these trying times. A big thank you to our own alumnus, Dr. Archana Krishnan, for accepting our invitation and enlightening our students and fellow faculty colleagues with this enriching talk. A very wide audience of almost more than 200 people have attended today's session.
Oh, really?
Yes. We also thank all the faculty members of the Department of Microbiology for their constant support in organizing the webinar series. There will be more, so please stay tuned for announcements through the Google groups. And finally, a big thank you to all the participants today, the enthusiastic 2-year students and faculty members who have attended this webinar and made it a grand success.
And you should keep sending me links too. So
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
Thank you.
Just in continuation with what Mayuri has been saying, I would like to tell all the participants that we are planning to probably have 2 webinars every week, and hope all of you will be able to join for these webinars, because they are not necessarily going to be COVID related. They can be something related to general biology topics also.
Also, I request all participants to fill in the feedback form to the day 2 as well, which has already been mailed to all the participants who have attended today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Archana.
Thank you, Archana. This was wonderful. Really
Yes.
nice talk.
Very nice.
And very, very well explained. From basics to the whatever level it was needed. Very nice.